Positivity generates expansive emotional spaces that open possibilities, whereas negativity restricted emotional spaces that close possibilities for action. That quote is by R. Echevarria. Do you think that positivity improves or enhances teamwork? If you do, raise your hands. If you agree with that, then probably you are right. However, not necessarily. The more you know about how to create effective teamwork in your team, the better you'll be able to actually do it. Today, I'm going to share with you about a fascinating research study that was done. And I'm also going to give you 2 examples that illustrate these key points. One of these are from 2 very different arenas. One's from show business and one is from technology. This key research study came from the American behavioral scientist. It's a very scientific study. This study involved 60 management teams. These teams were selected because, these teams were from a large information processing technology company. And they selected these particular teams because they had complete performance information for them. The data for the study was obtained through observation. They had trained observers who observed each of these teams during a strategic planning meeting. These observers were not privy to the performance information, so they were not biased by it. These observers looked to make note of 3 dimensions. First of all, positivity as compared to negativity. The way they determined this was they looked at how many positive statements were made during the meeting as compared with how many negative statements were made. The second dimension has to do with inquiry or advocacy. Did the person speaking during this meeting, the strategic planning meeting, ask questions of the others or advocate a position for themselves? And finally, was the person speaking more concerned about others or concerned about their own self-benefit? What this study showed was that the most high-performing teams were those that had the most positive statements. You'd expect that. In fact, the ratio was 5-to-1. In terms of these other 2 dimensions, they were balanced. So there's equal numbers of the other 2. On the other hand, the low-performing teams had mostly negative comments that were made during the meeting. They were people who advocated for themselves, and they advocated their own position, and they wanted to benefit themselves. They also took this data and looked at behavior patterns. And they discovered that the most high-performing teams had the most connectivity. And there's one more thing they did. Just for kicks, they plugged 100 into their model. The actual results showed, for high-performing teams, showed 5-to-1. But they plugged in 100 just to see what would happen. They were somewhat surprised because that did not result in a high-performing team. Without the tension between positive and negative, that team just didn't have any juice. It might be that that team just becomes unrealistically Pollyannish and is not able to produce good results. You don't want that for teamwork. My first example gives just the right amount of positivity and connectivity. And this is from show business. It's about the creation of West Side Story. The way this evolved, to me, is very interesting, because it didn't happen just immediately. The idea first came to Jerome Robbins. He was a director and a choreographer, and he had the idea that he wanted to, this was in 1949, and he wanted to make a contemporary version of Romeo and Juliet, and he wanted it to be about gang fights between Catholics and Jews. A lot of people thought that those kind of gang fights were kind of a stale subject at that point, but anyway, he wanted to do it. So he had a meeting of what he thought were key people. It was himself, and it was Arthur Lawrence, the scriptwriter, and Leonard Bernstein, the composer. They got together. What happened at this meeting was that somehow or the other, Arthur Lawrence got the impression that he was being asked to play an inferior role to Leonard Bernstein. And that did not sit well with him. He got angry. He stomped out of there, left, and the project was just, looked like it was over. 6 years went by. The two men that had the blowout were in Hollywood doing work independently of each other, and they bumped into each other at the Beverly Hills Hilton Pool. They started chatting. On a table near where they were was a headline about Mexican-American gang fights. Then what happened was a pivotal moment. This is exactly as Bernstein recalled it. Arthur and I looked at one another. All of a sudden, it sprang to life. We could feel the music and see the movement. It was electric. We could visualize the future product. They kept talking to each other about this, and eventually they settled on the idea that Puerto Rican gangs, which were really popular in the New York news those days, and Caucasian American gang fights would be like a fresh, cutting-edge type of gang to be in the musical. So they settled on that idea, and they changed it from East Side Story to West Side Story. They brought in 2 additional collaborators, Stephen Sondheim, the lyricist, and Oliver Smith, the set designer. And they all worked intricately together in a collaboration. They created this musical. What they were doing really was going outside the box. Nobody had ever created a musical that had singing, dancing, and acting all in the same musical. And also, it was on a theme. It was going to be a tragedy, and it was going to have a social controversy, that kind of angle to it. And that was new. Most of the current musicals were just feel-good comedies. So this was different. Bottom line is, it was a huge success in terms of both the art that was created and the business aspect. There were 760 performances on Broadway. It became a best-selling recording that was made based on this. In 1961, they created a film based on it, and that year they won most of the Oscars. So this was a huge success. My next example happened at Nokia. Nokia had examples of teamwork before this happened. What was different about this example from 2006 to 2011 was the level of teamwork. For instance, Nokia had Frank Nuovo, who had design teams that they worked together like a jazz band there. There was also Kaj Linden, the director of engineering, and he really promoted teamwork and in terms of concurrent engineering. What that was about was getting all the functions together at the beginning of a product development effort. Sales, production, and the new product development at the start of it. This example comes from another study, not to be confused with the other study I mentioned earlier. This study involved 3 software development teams. The typical method they used at Nokia to develop software was something called waterfall. The way that worked is that one group would work on it, and then the next group would work on it, and so on until they got the result produced. These three software teams did it differently. They did something called Agile. It was different because instead of producing the software in 18 months, they did it in 2 weeks. They did their work in a way where they were transparent to each other, so each one on the team knew what the other was doing. It was much more interactive. The question of the research study was, how did the developers feel about it and how effective was it? The answer to both of those questions was they liked it and yes, it was effective. None of them wanted to go back to the old way of doing it. So it worked. Now I want you to be able to take something away from this today that you can apply in your teamwork. So let's review. This space that you work in, emotional space, can be represented by this cloud. You want that to be big enough, expansive enough. If there's too much negativity, then that space just shrinks down and it's not good for teamwork, doesn't support teamwork. One thing that's important is to have equal participation. In the key study that I talked about, the points of advocacy and inquiry and self and other, those dimensions were even. So the equal numbers of both. That just really boils down to equal participation. In my first example about West Side Story, until they reached a point where there was equal participation, that just didn't even happen. So it's very important. And in my second example of software teams at Nokia, the people on a particular team were not necessarily of all the same hierarchical position, but they did have a much higher level of participation. So it's much closer to equal. The most important thing I want you to remember today is that it's important to have more positive than negative statements during your team meeting. That can be tough because you need to look at all the facts, whether they're positive or negative. In my first example about West Side Story, they broke all the rules. This had never been done before to create a musical like this, so that was the negative. But that inspired them to excellence. And in my second example of software teams at Nokia, they did their work transparent to each other, so to get all of the facts. Another thing about that way of working together is they were able to encourage you a lot, and they were able to achieve unprecedented speed by doing it that way. Now, you know more. My challenge to you is to use positivity and connectivity to make your team a high-performing team.